Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Hillary Serpis. I am the Vice President and Publisher of Route 50, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Protecting the Enlarged Perimeter, hosted by Duo Security. As you all know, state and local governments are under attack every day by malicious actors who are hungry for critical data within the agency networks. As the pandemic continues to enlarge the attack surface with telework, the government will need stronger defenses to allow only trusted users in. And identity and access management technologies are crucial to these new network environments. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get started with today's program, just a few housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, you'll find several icons, including the Q&A tab, which allows you to ask a question. We'll be fielding those questions towards the end of the program, but please do submit along the way so we can get right to the end of the questions right at the end of our panel discussion. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties, there is a red button at the bottom of the screen that says Test Your Connection. That button will take you to the help page, and from there you can browse a number of technical solutions and also chat directly with a member of our support team. Also note this webcast is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly after today's program. So if you miss anything or if you'd like to share with someone on your team, you'll be able to do that. All right, let's get started. To begin today's program, Josh Okada, our very own Senior Research Analyst at the Government Business Council, will give a presentation on the results of a recent survey of state and local governments' cybersecurity efforts. Josh, the floor is all yours.
Hillary, thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Okada. I'm a Senior Research Analyst with GBC, Government Business Council. We are the research arm of GovExec. So with a sponsorship with Duo, GBC conducted a research study in the spring and fall of 2020 to gauge cyber health over the course of the COVID pandemic. We fielded the study to a sample of state and local government employees who subscribe to Route 50, the Route 50 publication. We gathered around 400 respondents for our March survey and around 170 for our October 2020 survey. So our study had three main takeaways. The first is that respondents feel that state and local government is less protected than its federal counterpart. 54% of respondents believe that their agency is more or much more vulnerable to cyber threats than the federal government. The second takeaway is that respondents report a lack of data visibility and zero trust in their agencies. Respondent confidence in agency data visibility dropped by half from March to October of 2020. 32% of respondents in March reported that their agency has maximum visibility over critical data. And then in October of 2020, only 16% of respondents agreed. This drop in confidence might be due to a dispersion of workforce with the current COVID pandemic. Additionally, 53% of respondents are not confident that their agency leverages zero trust. This hasn't changed over the course of 2020, according to respondents. And our last key takeaway is that respondents suggest gaps in identity and access management that creates opportunities for hackers to exploit. Less than half of state and local employees report that their agency uses verification methods to ensure that users are who they say they are. And so really there are a number of areas of improvement for state and local government cybersecurity, particularly given the evolving technology landscape. How we use technology and where we use it is in part driving this change, and state and local government will be challenged to keep pace. Our team's survey report is publicly available if you're interested in learning a little bit more about our data points. And that's all I have today. So Hillary, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was great and great insights as we've come to expect from GBC. So thanks for sharing those. Before we start our panel discussion, I want to turn it over to Michael Wilson, Mike is the public sales engineer manager at Duo Security. As this whole event is brought to us by Duo Security. So Mike, I just wanted to open it up to you for a few brief remarks.
Yes, thank you, Hillary. So I get the pleasure today of kind of getting to set the table for the panel discussion, which is amazing. And in light of the report that we just heard about, I will go so far as to say that my responsibility and span of control at Duo is interesting because it puts me in a great position because of the fact that I'm maintaining responsibility for federal, state, local, and higher ed. I get to kind of see it all. And one of the interesting things is kind of how this is all not only impacting us at the state and local and the federal levels, but it also is impacting our personal lives. I mean, if you start thinking about what's going on with your banking, financial, what's going on in social media and everything, the ability to be identity proofed so that people know who you really are is becoming more important every day. The ability to prove who you are in that digital space is becoming more important every day. And that actually prevents, things like people speaking on your behalf, which could be very dangerous in this day and age. Also, the fact that we have, just these common fears. It's interesting because at that higher ed level, that we're seeing that the adoption of MFA as a standard to be able to make sure that, my stuff isn't stolen, my bank isn't cleaned out, my account isn't hijacked because now I'm a social media influencer or I want to be a social media influencer. So the things that we're seeing that are the trends right now are super interesting, and taking those trends and kind of making them into a ball. The other problem that we have in our personal lives that spans all the way across all of what's going on in this space too is password management. How do I keep track of all of these passwords and things that I have? So in that context, and kind of setting the table for the panel discussion of what's going on very specifically in state and local, is this concept of what's going on at home. I have at home now this, digital assistant whom I can summon with my voice, and I have these light switches, and I have these plugs, and all of these different things that I can switch on and off my lights, or I can call and summon music. And then I've got a car sitting in my parking lot that's got a cool little fob that if I have that fob, when I sit down and I push that button when I start my car, that will start my car. If I don't have it, the car won't start. What if I wanted to use that fob to be able to log into all of the rest of the things that are in my home, to log into the service that provides my digital assistant, to provide those light switches, all of those types of things that now I can have a unified and federated way to be able to get into all of that. That is, in essence, where we're moving towards, the ability to prove who you say you are with tokenization. The devices that are available to people are starting to come down in price. You'll see them as either baked into your smart devices or things like tokens like YubiKeys or Fedian keys or the Google Titan keys that they're offering now to be able to secure your environment. So what we're seeing this whole huge collapse of things that's happening in personal space that's also now starting to happen in enterprise. Now, I want to show you what it looks like real fast. So I'm going to share my screen here quickly and talk about what this concept of proving who you say you are looks like. And in that space, basically, you just assume that any workflow wherein that you would log into something, a username and password or a username and a token to be able to represent yourself, that you would be challenged in some way. So the authentication, instead of dumping you straight into an authentication process after you log into the application, is paused and you're given the opportunity to generate some sort of multi-factor event. In this case, I'll make this a little bigger on my screen. You see here that there are several different options to be able to select. Now, this is important because what I have seen in my own personal life when I log into my bank is that my wife gets a text message rather than me, and I have no option to be able to change that. So as you start to think about how this works in an enterprise environment in the state and local government for the staff of how to make this not something that's in the way, but something that is convenient for the user or something that can be constricted in such a way that they're only using the tokens and the devices that you would like them to use, especially in a distributed workspace, making sure that they're not simply inside the door on the local area network isn't good enough anymore. Instead, what we're starting to see is this push that moves away from complying to connect to the network Rather than that, now we would like them to comply to connect to the application. And the first important step of that is proving that they are who they say they are. So in this case, I'm going to say I want to use my smartphone to be able to do that. DO actually calls this a push notification, wherein I have the ability to approve or deny a multi-factor event. I'm going to approve that multi-factor event, and it's going to allow me into the application, and that's important. But that concept of comply to connect to the application is important as well. I want to make sure that the device is in the level of health that as they connect to that application, that I can feed back to the user what's important in order to be able to let the user know that they can self-help by saying, let's get an update for whatever is the issue, or in line by explaining to them, let's click on that. Let's say approve. Explaining to them, hey, in this case, it's your Firefox that's out of date today, and that you have the opportunity to update that. And if you don't, and you go to a slightly more critical application, later in the day or the next day, that we can actually now stop the user from accessing an application, even though they have a valid set of credentials. So I like to point this out because it highlights this concept of complying to connect to the application, which is, if I go back to the personal life example of being able to use, your car key to log into your digital assistant, and then also all of the other services that are involved, is that you need some sort of middleware in order to be able to do that. And so we're starting to see the formation of these companies similar to Duo in that it ties together a user with a stack of authenticators that can prove who they say they are, and then allows real-time, I jokingly call it, must be this tall to ride the roller coaster, real-time compliance to make sure that you're meeting the minimum requirements to be able to access an application. And then finally, for certain applications that are your crown jewel applications, that you're on the proper device. So I bring all that to the table, and we'll leave it with just one more statement in that those three things, the ability to prove who you are at the time of access, the ability to be assessed in real time, and the ability to detect if you're on the right device that your enterprise wants you to be on whenever you access an application. Those are the three component pillars of zero trust networking. You'll see in the market many different products and things that are put out there that say that this is zero trust, but there's no one SKU that you can go and buy. In essence, what we're seeking to do is we're changing the way that networking is done to make it dynamic at the time of access, that you can do those three things so that the people that are hosting those applications have a level of trust that was greater than just knowing what your IP address was, or that you're on, a certain local area network or VPN connection. So in that light, I would like to go ahead and introduce my counterpart today as a panelist. And you have to be careful with our names because I am Micah Wilson and he is Michael Watson. So we'll be sure to call our names out carefully as we go through to make sure you're dealing with the correct person. But Micah as the public sector leader for Duo Security, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Michael take over for a second to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, and I do think it's good. I figure, if nothing else, like having identity conversation with very similar names seems very appropriate, right? Just to make sure we get our identities correct. So first off, let me say thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for having me. I'm Michael Watson. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. I work at the Virginia IT Agency. We provide a whole bunch of services, technology services out to all of our executive branch agencies. And my responsibility in particular is to both provide governance requirements as well as oversight and implementation of the security infrastructure at the agencies. I've been working there for longer, it seems longer every year, but about 15 years at this point. So I've had a good amount of experience in the state and working with folks, and we have a great team over there, and thought this was appropriate for challenges, especially in the state environment. I was happy to kind of talk about some of the topics today. So go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Great. So I think I will kick us off and just thank you to both of you for joining us. I live in Virginia, so first, thank you for what you do. And thanks for keeping us safe. But I thought I'd start with kind of the most obvious or most pressing top of mind question, and that's to start with COVID, right? And what's transpired since last March. So this is a two-part question. With the rapid move that we've seen to remote work from the pandemic, what are some of the lessons we learned in 2020 that should remain top of mind as we enter 2021? And then specifically, what are some of the key cybersecurity considerations that state and local governments should have on their radar for 2021? So Michael, how about you kick us off, and then Micah, you can join.
Sure. So, and I think Micah's conversation to start off with was pretty good, and actually highlighted a number of the challenges that you run into when you go from this sort of in-person communication environment to all of a sudden no one sees each other, and if you're lucky, you've got video, between folks. We have this large identity proofing problem that all of a sudden comes to the forefront of the environment, because if you're trying to do things like sign documents that we typically did in person, and I got to watch you sign that document or have your known signature on that document, and all of a sudden I can't do that anymore, I have a difficult time proving that I'm the one who put my signature on that document. So we essentially saw this happen across the board, pretty much everywhere all at once, right? So as an IT agency, it was our job to figure out ways to kind of address that problem. And while there are tools and such that are out there, what we found is that our biggest issue was process-based. We have the state is we're budget conscious, right? So not every place had digital signature capabilities. We had to figure out ways to deploy increased remote connectivity out to a whole bunch of folks. And with that was making sure that only those folks that we wanted to connect, were getting into the environment. It caused it caused a combination of us, deploying technologies very quickly, as well as taking on a little bit more risk than what we were typically comfortable with. And I'll say that I think, that's probably the thing that we, I'll say experienced and got comfortable with the most is how to be uncomfortable with taking on, risk very quickly. That concept of saying sometimes, I'm not going to be able to prove 100% that the person signed the document, or that I'm going to have to initially at least let folks in without doing my compliance checks or whatever else it is that we were doing was what we started with in the pandemic. What I think we all as security professionals kind of figured out pretty quickly was ways to retrofit the environment or bring in new technology or introduce things to make it better. But whenever you end up in a scenario where you're taking on risk that's sort of outside your risk threshold, you have to figure out a way to bring it back in at some point. I think a lot of folks have spent the end of last year and the beginning of this year starting to focus on that, especially knowing that there's an end in sight. I'm keeping my fingers double crossed that nothing changes, but there appears at least to be an end in sight in the near future. We need to be able to make sure that the steps that we take and the protections that we put in place bring us closer to where we're comfortable with our risk threshold being. But I tried to explain to a lot of folks when we were talking through. They're saying, well, normally you're way harder line about taking on these particular risks. I said, yeah, but you've got to remember our job as risk professionals is to make sure we know when it's okay to take on a little more and when it's not. And in this case, there's not really many circumstances we're going to run into with a worldwide pandemic like we did. So adjusting that is part of the job, and I'll say it's relatively infrequent that we get to adjust towards the more risk scenario than the less risk in such a larger scale way.
Micah, do you want to add your thoughts to that?
Yeah, so just from the concept of expanding that thought and some of the very specific changes at the technology level, things like institutions running out of enough computers to send home with the staff. One of the key issues that we run across any number of times, so that now, one of the risks that I have seen taken is using personal devices when that wouldn't have been possible before. So knowing kind of now that you've got people that have their own devices that you may or may not meet your posture, and figuring out ways to handle that. And then the trust of the actual user, the ability to identify that it is that user acting in such a way. So, you know, and again, just hearkening back to the ways and the metrics that we measure to be able to figure out that these really are the people. You know, what are the technologies that aren't getting in the way of you know, making sure that the 300 additional users that we now have connecting to VPN can get onto that VPN, and that it's not going to overwhelm our help desk. You know, and then, you know, if I think back to this time last year, the major risks that we were dealing with at the state and local level, it was almost all crypto lockers. It was something's going to get onto our network, it's going to go through and encrypt all of our stuff, and we're going to be held for ransom. It's now that type of technology and thinking expanding risk into, now it's not all, even the users can't walk to the help desk and have them look at this email that I feel like is a phish. You know, now I have to kind of make my own decision at home. So yeah, you know, just kind of echoing not only that sentiment at the state and local level, but, you know, again, it seems to be the types of changes that will not only change the way that we do business, but also where we sit when we do business. I see some of these things sticking around for a while in the remote work and impacting even some of the what's the word, the offices, the buildings, the places where we go and sit. So, you know, Michael, I guess I would ask you, you know, in the grand scheme of things, what were your key risks prior to the pandemic that were your number 1, 2 items that you were thinking about, and how quickly did those change, or did they just get folded into that larger risk?
Yeah, and you actually hit, you know, pretty much where we're at, right? Last year, the biggest focus for you know, state and local and a number of folks, especially Virginia, was pretty much ransomware. And to a certain extent, it still is. Don't get me wrong. We definitely still have that exposure as far as you know, major concern, and see those types of things happening in the news relatively frequently. It's just, you know, we're dealing with the immediate component where folks still need to be able to connect and you know, get their business done at the same time. We definitely were spending a lot of time looking at the ransomware, I'll say, issues that pop up within the state. We did a large focus, and as part of our you know, processes, to make sure that we not only understand how our connectivity backups and the rest of the standard controls, access management, and the rest of our standard controls that are in place were working, and making sure that they were effective against some of the more common ransomware attacks. But we were also trying to make sure that the localities that end up connecting into our networks, you can imagine, you know, Department of Health and, you know, social services, and those folks that have systems that exist with the state level, they all interconnect and work with us. Elections is another one, right? You know, we've got connections at the localities that come back to the state. So we spend a lot of time working to make sure that those connections and stuff are protected as much as possible. It's always, you know, and that means that, of course, we want to make sure that the environment and those people that are operating in that environment are also as protected. We do spend a lot of time working on, you know, access management is one of our key security components. We know that 2-factor is kind of the de facto standard at this point, right? If there's anything in place, that's where we start. That is, you know, one of the most effective controls that we can leverage to prevent ransomware, as well as a bunch of other types of security attacks. But, you know, we focus very heavily on that, as well as, you know, making sure that we have at least some level of information security programs in place at an organization. While it may not be something that seems like it makes that much of a difference, right? If they just don't have any of the controls in place, the fact that they know that they're missing, you know, the important controls, and that's something that's ingrained in their business, makes a huge difference. You know, we flag any organization, third party or whoever that we're working with, if they don't have a program, that's a big problem, right? That's a #1 red flag for anyone.
Yep. So just highlighting one thing that really stood out for me is that the MFA, the multi-factor I agree 1,000%. It's the place to start, and people know what multi-factor does from an anti-phishing standpoint. It's like, hey, listen, if I'm doing multi-factor, then it makes it harder to phish. But they kind of forget the two other things that MFA does. So MFA also adds attribution. So if you're doing a strong cryptographic function, that means that ownership of whoever actually is taking over that activity, that raises the bar on what they need to do. So that also addresses insider threat. And a lot of people don't realize that by adding MFA, you're adding trust to your users because you're assigning attribution. They did something that was normally a higher level that would be required to get that done. And then finally, whenever you add MFA to an existing network, it also will do you a great service in sussing out if you have been breached. So the fact that you're adding MFA into a live system, yes, you get the phishing protection, you get the attribution that takes away plausible deniability, but you also are adding the ability to start detecting if your credentials are being harvested and used on your network without your knowledge. So, I tend to agree in strong ways that MFA is the place to start, and Duo would even go so far as to say that's the first step into a zero trust journey, whether it's with the Duo product or not. So yeah, nice call out.
So I do want to talk about zero trust here in a bit, but I want to go back to remote work. As we know, not everyone can totally work remotely, right? Particularly a lot of government employees and first responders. So how can organizations be sure that their technology infrastructure supports people who have to be out in the field? And what does a centralized security footprint look like to accommodate that? Micah, do you have some thoughts on that? And then maybe, Michael, you can follow up.
Yeah, so I'll be quick because I'm not the one that's working in the trenches. But what I will say is I am definitely seeing a trend that is moving away from applications that are executable based. So, you double click the icon, it's the exe on your desktop, and that pops open. It seems instead that what's happening is that it's moving into more of a web browser is the application. And you can even think of the web browser as being the apps on smart devices. In essence, it feels as if applications are changing to be more built around not local area network access. But there are still those applications. So having certain people in the buildings, the people that need to interact with each other, having certain applications that are slightly more difficult to protect because they were not built with cloud in mind. They were not built with web in mind. We even still, and I'd be curious, Michael, if you guys still have mainframes sitting around, any AS400 type things and those types of stuff. But we are definitely seeing this trend and this gravity of even the users that are working in the office buildings are now starting to use more and more resources that are cloud-based or outside of that facility. And then the applications that still live within the data center are becoming kind of webified in a way that in the long run, it looks as if they will move away from VPN to be able to get to those to some sort of reverse proxy in between. But I'll let the pros actually handle that question. Those are just the trends that I'm seeing. So I'll throw it to Michael.
Yeah, and that those actually line up very well with what we're seeing as well. And just to make sure to put your mind at ease, we do still have the 30-year-old applications lying around somewhere that sit on the mainframe. There's definitely one that's still out there. We have cloudified it as much as possible, but we're also pushing, of course, for folks to migrate off. And for the most part, that's when we're seeing these large migrations and these upgrades, modernization. It's exactly as Micah indicated. We're seeing a large push towards, web applications as kind of the de facto standard, and that which makes sense, right? I mean, most of the protocols and stuff that we've got and the technology and software that's out there allows us to leverage our standard web services. We can put filters in place. We can put additional authentication in place. We have all of these tools and capabilities when they work at that level. When you've got those custom coded applications or the executables that are out there, it's a lot more challenging to deal with. That's not to say that there isn't a place for them. We obviously have, we have over 2,500 different applications in the Commonwealth, right? So there's definitely a large portion of them that still are the kind of standalone binary. You run an exe or whatever to function, but we are more and more seeing mostly web applications that are out there, and I think that as we see that trend go forward, we're able to offer, since my organization works very much like a technology services firm, right? We are introducing new services and new items for the agencies to consume, new types of technology for the agencies to consume. The more they get those quicker if they're using, the more standardized technology that's out there. So we're able to, kind of leverage that a little bit. So yeah, your assessment's right on, and that's exactly the kinds of stuff we're seeing.
Do you know of your user base? I mean, I know there's different levels of users. Your fairly standard users, your email users, then your power users. Are there certain applications or certain functions that may not even be IT related that are still kind of keeping people in the buildings?
So we in the state there's always that component, right? We have certain things that we are unable to do remotely. We have museums, for example, right? You can't, while there is actually some really great digital museum exhibits, there are some things that just aren't going to function that way. We have, driver license issuing, like you still, in order to actually do the identity proofing, there has to be an in-person transaction that occurs. We haven't developed a way to do that all online and digitally yet. We kind of go down the path of trying to look at it, but what it comes down to is it's a difficult thing to do. Identity proofing, to actually say that we as a state can verify the person who they say they are is pretty hard when it comes down to it. And it's something that we obviously know that a lot of people use licenses to verify proof of identity in other circumstances. So being wrong on that is a pretty big deal. So we treat that with some pretty significant importance. But there's a number of functions that are similar to that we have in the state that just can't support being remote. Troopers can't pull people over from their computers. And we've got a whole bunch of functions that are like that. I think we're in this state, we've done a lot to try to support virtualization across the board. And what we're looking to in the future is to say, what does this look like for us as far as making sure that the technology has a built-in capability to be remote wherever you are? We've all gotten used to, the WebEx meetings where, we're sitting there and talking to folks. But if we were looking at this a year and a half ago, we weren't really all that great about when we had a virtual meeting, making sure we're including the folks that were dialed in or on the web. It just was, you were talking to the folks in the room and you check in with the people online every so often. There's a little bit of a culture shift that we've been pushing and making sure that when we finally do go back, because some of this remote stuff is definitely going to stick around. If nothing else, there's good cost cutting and stuff for, businesses and even within the state for not having as large of buildings. We want to be able to say, part of our normal culture and part of our interaction with people is the online video interaction and the online audio interaction where video is not possible. So I think we've been setting ourselves up to try to maintain that in going forward. And I know a lot of other organizations are considering that same thing. I'm sure it won't be easy because we'll want to fall back into previous habits, but I think it's definitely something that we're all trying to integrate as much as possible.
I'm feeling really lucky today because it's not often I get to sit and pick a brain like yours. So, so Hillary, I've got one more tack on question. So yeah, because of working with the federal government, I see a lot of policy. I see a lot of stuff that goes on, from the FBI side and things like that. What you were talking about troopers and mobile forces. I mean, some of that is still exactly the same as it was. It didn't really change much, but I do actually see. And I don't know if it's because of CARES money that's being delivered or what, but it's definitely a focus more towards what the federal government requirements or guidances are for NIST for things like connecting to CGIS and things like that. How important of a role does that play? I mean, even before pandemic, but also currently as we're talking about enlarging the perimeter, does that policy piece play in quite a bit, a little, not at all?
It's huge. In fact, there have been many gatherings between myself and a number of the other state CISOs where we'll get together and essentially talk about how are we addressing and what types of strategies are we using to maintain compliance with all of those individual requirements, because there are some very specific items in there. CGIS has very specific authentication requirements. IRS 1075 has very specific data location and data storage requirements. And then of course you get into, HIPAA for privacy and things like that. There are a number of regulatory pieces that that impact us and the way that we're, trying to approach, protecting data and providing and maintaining our services. I'll say that if there's, as far as if there is a state regulatory, if there's a U.S. regulatory requirement out there, somewhere in the state probably has it. The number of acronyms that I've got memorized for the different regulatory bodies is getting a little crazy, but they all want the same kind of thing. They want levels of security around the environment. What we've been trying to actually figure out how to do for a while is to adopt it into something that is a little bit more uniform and has stages attached to it, right? We know that, CGIS and 1075 data, the tax data, are two very, very important data sets that have a lot of very, private or confidential information. It's very confidentiality focused. Same thing with some of the HIPAA components. There are other requirements and other regulatory entities that focus on different things, whether it's more about the integrity of the data or different focuses on the confidentiality of the data. We're trying to see where we can adopt our models and integrate that as a set of standards. That stuff hasn't really, changed all that much in the pandemic. We still have to do it, right? Regardless of how difficult it becomes, or if we have somebody that's been exposed to COVID that still needs to get information. And you can imagine what would happen if we had, a trooper that finds out they've been exposed, but they still have to be able to communicate some information in. That actually does pose a challenge for us, where we've got somebody that's remote in a situation where we don't typically have people remote. Now we've adapted and figured out ways to handle it, but it's all those things are what we were trying to consider when we're looking at this.
Micah, do you have any other questions? Are we ready to move on to maybe zero trust?
Yes, please.
So why don't we do that? Why don't we talk about zero trust? I did find it interesting, as Josh mentioned earlier. What were the numbers? I think he said, I wrote it down. 53% of agencies the respondents are confident their agency doesn't leverage zero trust. So maybe we can talk about how agencies can introduce flexibility while still pushing for zero trust. So who wants to start there?
And I think it's kind of why I started the way I started with the conversation today, because the disambiguation of zero trust, or demystifying what that means. Let me say it a different way. Ubiquitous access from any device with a sliding risk meter of how important it is that the information that you're trying to get to is accessible on the device by the user, that you can validate who they are. So, one of the nice things that we got out of the federal government, which is I'm seeing trickle down now because it's great guidance, is there was a special publication out of NIST in late 2018, 2019. It's special publication 800-63, which goes through and defines identity proofing and the things that need to be done for it, and then all of the types of authenticators that you can use to add multi-factor. And then finally, how you can take those two things combined and then federate them. So it's a great piece of policy. If you haven't run across it, it definitely helps with the CGIS and all of those other things. But the real key here is the fact that, as we're looking at 5G LTE, as we're looking at what has become an acceleration of people working all over the place. And that's really, I think, what has enlarged the perimeter and really caused zero trust to be first in the mind of everyone, is because of when you just take everyone and you scatter them, there already was this wave because of the webification of applications that has just been, it feels like to me, moved forward 2 to 3 years and accelerated, where if you can do something as simple as what I showcased at the top of the call, pause the standard off process that the people that are trained to work on those applications already know how to do, add the multi-factor component as the initial step of having that user prove who they say they are, and then selecting, products or vendors that either by themselves or together can add then that comply to connect to the application methodology that defines whether or not you can be trusted because of how strong your MFA event was, and then that you're on the right device and it's in the right posture. So it's actually, it's an interesting thing to see what people's different versions of zero trust is in their mind, but just kind of distilling it down to its basic components. That's it. Prove who you say you are from whatever device that you're on, and then we get to be able to decide, not because of what IP address that you're on or not because of what VPN connection that you're on, whether or not you're allowed to have access to this information. And to me, it really feels like it's accelerating. So I definitely am curious as to what Michael thinks about, what zero trust means to the state.
Go ahead, Michael.
All right. Yeah, and I think that there's definitely been an acceleration, like you mentioned. And we've seen even some of just the general conversations we've had with third parties and discussing what options are out there. We've seen a lot more of the zero trust conversation come up. I will say that I think it was beginning to accelerate anyway as we moved to this more distributed environment, right? We introduced, as organizations are introducing more and more software as a service components, they're leveraging less physical infrastructure and more cloud infrastructure. It's not as easy to implement and put in place, some of the custom authentication methods that we used in the past. And not only that, it's actually easier just to leverage some out of the box, authentication component in most circumstances. Because of that distributed component of the way that we were starting to move towards business, that zero trust component becomes more and more focused, because you don't necessarily know, like if you start having part of your solution in Amazon and part of your solution in your location and another part in some other third-party cloud service, you've got to have them all connect, but you don't necessarily want to trust all of Amazon coming into your environment, and all of a sudden all of the connectivity requirements and IP proofing and it gets really complicated very quickly. And anytime you make a change to one of those components, you have to change everything else. And because of that, it is driving more and more to look, let's just set this whole thing up. Let's set our whole environment up to not worry about the actual number of connections. We just put it into our processes and set it up as automation. And if we have a structured zero trust process, when we introduce when we put up, tear down, migrate systems from one spot to another, the process handles it. The technology is in place to be able to support it. And we no longer have this challenge of weeks in order to set up the configuration or design necessary for point A to communicate to point B. We set up instead to say all you need to do is prove that you are the source, the authorized source of information, and you're allowed to get access to this destination of information, and the rest is just kind of handled as part of our technology and process, whether it's leveraging authentication components, or whether you're doing some sort of key proofing to say that you are the right system. There are a whole bunch of different approaches to it, but that whole concept allows us to be a lot more flexible as we're trying to deploy new technology. So introducing and putting tighter security boundaries on those areas in the data that are most important to us.
So you nailed it. And seriously, if you can solve that problem in the state and then take it and figure out how to solve it for the citizen, so that that example I led off with, so I can use the car key fob as my authenticator into all of those. I say that because it reiterates the point in that in order to federate across all of those different disparate, the things that are not the same, and you don't want to trust one more than the other, you end up with this concept of a cloud-based middleware. And it's an authentication middleware that can handle workflow, and identity proofing for the citizen. That's a dangerous game, because is it the banks? It can't be the state or the federal government, because that becomes a state or government, ID above and beyond, what we're allowed to do constitutionally in some states, or at the federal government. So yeah, I mean, this is where I see the problem for both enterprise and people's personal lives as we become more digital and tech savvy, as how do I tie all of this stuff together and federate it in such a way where I'm not stovepiping my auth process every single time. And that, I'll make my one solid plug for Duo at this point, because that's really what we do, is we glue together authentication processes no matter what the service is. We're simply an integration machine that goes in and pauses off processes, grabs the usernames, and looks for the authenticator and the policy that goes along with it. So what you described is what I'm also seeing at the county level. It's what I'm seeing at the city level. It's what I'm seeing at the state level. It's what I'm seeing between countries. Like whenever we talk about federal and the Five Eyes communities and things like that, where different countries are trying to figure out how to interoperate and establish trust for those users. So yeah, I mean, you've just kind of called out what I perceive to be the problem of the ages for where we are in technology, and looking for ways to address that, where you're not just building, additional stovepipe on top of stovepipe. This one kind of panacea term of zero trust has come out to be able to represent solving that problem. So, I'll throw that back to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely the challenge that I think we're all kind of focused on, because it fixes most of our technology and user-based issues, right? If we essentially are able to say, whether it's a system or a user or any other, origination point, if we know we can trust it and we establish some sort of trust protocol between the two locations, our security challenges get drastically easier to handle. It reduces the impact of things like ransomware. If you were to think of something for ransomware where if you know that your trust level between a number of systems is limited to, let's just say 6 systems, because that's all that particular user would have any business getting access to, the rest of your environment wouldn't be taken down in the case that somebody actually, their credentials are compromised, or somehow or another they bypass the authentication, or whatever it may be. Having microsegmentation and smaller areas of trust protects the systems from large impacting events, which is where ransomware really, gets its punch from. It's not the fact that the systems get compromised or that you even lose the data. It's that the organization can't recover because it's just too much has been taken down, or they lose absolutely every single piece of their data versus a portion of it that would be stored on a specific, trust level within an environment. So there's a lot of there's a lot of benefit having that zero trust. It solves a lot of the security challenges that we're dealing with and reduces the risk overall to an organization. It is just very difficult to implement. Not to say it can't be done, but it's absolutely difficult to implement and takes some time.
Yeah. So I had a non-technical layperson that was an airman explain to me that mentality of a weapons explosion, where they actually design the cases of the weapon systems so that if the ammo blows, it blows front and back out, not into the craft of the body. So microsegmentation, containment, some really cool explanations of how to do that. So Hillary, I'll throw it back to you, looking at the time to make sure we're hitting all of our questions.
We only have about 10 more minutes because we want to get to some Q&A. So maybe we'll just go a little bit more rapid fire. So if one of you wants to answer, raise your hand, you start, and then we'll move to the next question. So our whole session today is talking about securing the enlarged perimeter. Can one of you share how state and local governments can get more of a comprehensive picture of their attack surface?
I'll go ahead and start there, and I'll try to be relatively quick. Knowing your attack surface, especially in the environment today, is really difficult, just because of the interconnections between all the different systems that are out there. Like I said, when you're looking at software as a service components, as well as some of the regular infrastructure that you've got in place, and the exposure of web services out to your clients, whether in our case it's citizens, but it could be to anybody. You're essentially pushing your surface area out more and more. I think, as Micah put it earlier, it is driving a lot of it to be standardized on web pages and standard mobile applications and things for standard access. But that's really where we start to measure our attack surface area, is what are we publishing out for folks to be looking at. That's the first place to start. There's of course internal stuff, right? The old mantra was hard outside and chewy center. You still have to be careful about that, but I think in today's world, most of the push is a lot of our applications already being exposed to external parties or on the to web as web pages that allow access easily, even internally or externally.
Yeah, so we try to simplify all of that down into, you know, what's the biggest risk reducer, you know, bang for your buck. So updating the systems, making sure everything's patched, you know, so on and so forth as it's accessing the information, and then prevent phishing. If you can do those two things, then you're generally, you know, knocking out a large majority of the risk. And I can give you a great example is when you start connecting things and you actually build those processes into an overarching system. You know, working for Duo as a portion of the larger Cisco with 85,000 employees now, there was a big iOS exploit over the last several weeks where moving to iOS 14.4, and I'll throw this out there, if you've not updated yet, please update. It's an important one. It's a single text message hack that does not even require you to interact with it. So it's one of the dangerous ones. But as of today, February 3rd, all of the systems at Cisco that are protected by Duo, that if you actually try to use your device running 14 dot whatever, you know, less than 4, you can neither use that device as an authenticator to approve a push notification, nor can you access any of the information from that device. And that's the speed to security of zero trust and comply to connect to the application, because whenever you have a massive covers the entire surface of everyone in your enterprise that uses an iPhone, whether you provided it to them or not, that you can quickly and easily address those in a way that people can't get through the cracks. So, you know, we're after the big home run type things. We'll work with the other companies in the ecosystem to do, you know, it's like Michael just said, the GUI inside and the crunchy perimeter. That's not the way it works anymore. You know, it's risk-based and it's layered. No one layer is going to protect it. We're going to try to show up and handle those, you know, top tier risks of make sure that you're complying to connect to the application and that your device is healthy because it's updated and that you've not been phished.
All right, great. I think we'll just jump to the final question. I always like to end on maybe a specific takeaway for our audience. So Michael, maybe you can start and share with us two things. First, the challenges, and I think we've talked about this, but maybe ending on the challenges in managing an identity access management strategy as a result of the pandemic. And then if you would recommend one first step for anyone beginning their identity access management journey, what would that be?
All right, so I think the biggest challenge for, and I think we covered a few of these, so you know, it'll make it pretty straightforward. But the biggest challenge, as far as strategy goes, is doing your initial proofing, your enrollment, your how do I verify that the person I'm actually talking to or interacting with is the one that I meant to enroll or allow access to a particular system. If you can do that right in the beginning, you're golden. If you struggle or you don't do that, or you allow folks to, I'll say, not go through an official proofing process, it becomes an issue, you know, later on. We ran into this, so if you, and I'll try to dovetail it into one of the questions I saw pop up, the fraud within the state, right? So we all know that unemployment requests went up pretty significantly during COVID because a lot of people were without work. We also know that a lot of those requests were fraud-related requests, right? They were fraud-related requests because it was very difficult to figure out whether the person that was submitting the request was legitimate or not. The proofing of that person and ensuring the identity that is requesting it was tied to the fact that they were out of work was a really, really hard thing to do, and still is a hard thing to do. We've gotten better, obviously, over time and experience, but that actual one step there is the part that I would say is almost, you know, the most critical part of a program, and make sure that you've had a good strategy for it. The other thing, as far as the first thing getting started, make sure you've got your policies and standards down in the beginning. You're going to have to distribute out a lot of the information to people to operationalize within their environments, and it needs to be clear and concise directions as to what when people are building their environments and putting technology in place, what they have to comply with in order for it to work correctly. Leverage existing standards. Do not create stuff on your own. because it works a lot better when you're integrating with other parties, which you inevitably will have to do at some point. So I'll let Micah jump in, and I think those are my two biggest ones.
I got nothing to add on that. No, nailed it.
Okay, I'm going to move on. I think you answered one of the questions from the audience in your final answer, so I'm going to move on. There's two more questions. What do you guys think of cybersecurity on OT platforms? Does anyone want to take that?
So I'm assuming that OT platforms like SCADA systems or systems that might not historically have been designed around. They're more physical in access, so control points and things like that for electrical grids and stuff of that nature. From my perspective, I'll give a funny little analogy that I use every once in a while. So if you know Cyberdyne Systems and Skynet from the Terminator movies at all, information, IoT devices and those types of things, I'm a firm believer of even putting MFA in between devices that talk to each other. And systems like that, so that at some point, if you just put them in bypass mode, if they go rogue or they start doing their own thing, that you can actually flip on the MFA component so that human interaction is required so that the machines can't do something by themselves. It's a little bit of a joke, but I hope it's a joke. I see these, the DODs coming out with the little cyber dogs that run around, and I saw one dance the other day, and that frightened me. So yeah, I mean, I think there are cybersecurity steps that we can take. Again, I will just say MFA is always, to me, the place to start. Just making sure that you can insert some sort of human interaction, even if it is machines talking to each other, that you have that capability.
Yeah, and I think IoT stuff is hard mostly because it is low powered and inflexible as far as the capabilities attached to it. So once it's manufactured, if somebody makes a mistake, it's very difficult to fix. And if we've proven anything as a human race, we're going to make mistakes. And the fact that we are manufacturing items that don't accommodate that very well is a difficult one to to handle. I think the IoT nut has yet to be fully cracked. I agree. If we were able to essentially introduce a lot of the same technologies or security controls that we leverage in our environment today, we would have much less of a problem. However, most of the IoT infrastructure just isn't built that way. So we've got to try to come up with some levels of creative solutions, but I don't know that we have a very good feeling for what is acceptable output. So for example, if we put some tools in place and identify somebody is a malicious actor in there, turning off the system as a response isn't really a good one if it's controlling, I don't know, the power to the East Coast or, a water to somewhere or whatever. That causes a bit of a problem. So there's this overall design feature and function that we've got to kind of come up with here. The OT component, because it attaches and ties to the physical world directly, is just a little bit different. We can apply the same security controls, though, to Micah's point, and see very dramatic success with it. We just need to figure out how we build the systems to support that.
So one final question from the audience. What role, if any, do you see blockchain technology playing in this arena?
So blockchain has some possibilities. I will say that not the actual dollar expense, but the computational expense attached to it adds some complications that I think are still kind of yet to be overcome. I can see the fact that you have unique values that can't be altered and are known to everybody being beneficial. Like I could, if I were in a sky's the limit kind of scenario, I could see leveraging standard identity numbers or something like that for everybody out there in the world or country or whatever scope you want to put on it, and be able to leverage that, and everybody knows what it is. It doesn't have to be a secret, and no one can change it, right? We can guarantee that that particular identifier is tied to a person. Like I can see where there's value in that, but getting that in place and making sure that everyone is on the same page, as well as being able to computationally afford the cycles necessary to continue that is not a small amount of effort. So, I like the concepts. I think the applicability, though, has some challenges attached to it.
Yeah. So, it's just the concept of blockchain as a ledger that is immutable. Michael, I'll just call out what you said before. People make mistakes, and if you have now a system that you can't pull those mistakes out of, it's great for things like recording citizens that have been dead for thousands of years. If you've got all of this information about historical things that aren't going to change, it's really good. But if you want to protect, say, logs from a system and you're dumping those into a blockchain that can never go away, you're just going to have expanding and growing, DASD or storage requirements that this will never go away, and that it will get harder and harder to go and mine that for information. So I do see blockchain playing into portions of this, and especially in the security space for, some super important things that we need to remember forever. But as an overarching technology that's immediately applicable, I still think we're a handful of years away from seeing, blockchain in this space.
Okay, I know you're not going to believe it, but we're right at the top of the hour. Our time is up, literally right at 2 o'clock. I think the two of you probably could be talking for another 5 hours. But so I want to thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. More importantly, thank you also to Duo Security for hosting today's webcast and bringing us together for this hour and giving the two of you the opportunity to have this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, it'll be available, this webcast will be available on demand. So for those of you watching, please share with your colleagues. Thank you, Michael, Micah. Great being able to spend this hour with you. And to the rest of you, thanks for joining in and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.